Shots from the Hip presents Sports History. Here are Jason and Oz.
All right, let's take a trip back in time. Let's check out some history.
Let's take a trip through time. And in fact, basically, let's see. Okay, I always mix this up. Hang on just a sec, folks. Basically, not only are we going back in time, we're also going to go into a parallel universe. Okay, so we got some real multiverse, Marvel universe kind of stuff. Are you seeing this? You're still not seeing this screen.
Yep.
Oh, you are? Okay. All right. Let's talk about baseball. Specifically, the origin of baseball. I've been doing these a few times on this show lately. So very strange series of events. All right. I'm going to talk about this. We're going back to basically we're going back to the origins of baseball. All right.
Mhm.
But the story where I would like to begins in 1904. Okay. With Henry Chadwick. Again, I love bringing in these 19th century bearded guys and telling you, oh, yes, he's one of the most important figures in sports history. Well, Henry Chadwick is, of course, not as a player, but as a journalist. Chadwick is one of the guys who really forms what we now take for granted as sports journalism, sports reportage. He's known as the first great baseball writer. If you would like to see some of his stuff, I'll show you some through this talk. Let's say through this segment. We can put it in the notes and whatever. But basically, our story begins in 1904. Okay, so in 1904, he wrote a piece for the Sporting News, and this was in December. Okay, now this is 1904. In December, in sports in America, I assume also in Canada, the landscape is dead, right? Nothing is happening. Yes, you have the so-called National Hockey League, but of course, this is 6 teams, right? As you famously know, a couple of whom were in Canada, right? So you're basically talking about 4 northeastern markets for hockey. Most of the country doesn't care. College football is done in the country, right? These are the days when all you had. 1904, to be fair, I don't even know if they had the Rose Bowl that year. But in those days, college football ended at the end of the calendar year, right? So we're basically winding down the college football season. Nothing is happening in American sports. So Chadwick wrote this piece, and this is the Sporting News. So they're just trying to fill space. And basically, he wrote a piece on the early history of baseball. Now, again, weird to think about in our time, right? We have photographs, right? We have video, right? We have computers that store data. Well, guess what? In the 1830s and 40s, these things were in pretty short supply in America. And so you would get things like this, right? Chadwick reminiscing about the early days of baseball in America. Okay, so he wrote this piece, which, hang on just a moment. I am looking for my notes on this. But he wrote this piece, and in this piece, he said, for those listening on the audio, you will be surprised that when I tell you this year of 1904 completes a period of over 70 years since the first regular baseball club was organized. Okay, this club was the Olympic of Philadelphia, which began its existence in 1833.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. pretty far back. Again, this is organized ball. The rules, like I've said on shows in the past, the rules are not codified, right? So basically, each baseball club is playing, with their own rules and whatever, which makes it really convenient, right, for the home team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so now, Chadwick himself did not actually witness this game. Chadwick was born in 1824 in Exeter, England, right? And in a good old American story, he came to Brooklyn with his family at age 12. Okay. Now, when he was young, of course, Chadwick is not exactly a blue blood, but he's definitely not your immigrant with a nickel in his pocket kind of story. All right. I mean, these were moneyed people in Britain. So at the time, he was mostly into music. But he did play a lot of sports, especially ball and bat games like cricket. Right. But what he's talking about here is a sport called town ball, right? Which is what in America we said was the precursor to baseball back in those days. Here it is. Here's Chadwick talking about town ball. He says in the piece, the old game of town ball was simply an American edition of the English game of rounders, which is a kid's game in England, which I used to play 65 years ago when a schoolboy in England. All right. Town ball, he notes, was in vogue in New England states during the 30s. Okay. Now that's the 1830s, folks. That's not the 1930s, right? Okay. So in the piece, Chadwick goes on to describe town ball. Okay. Here's the way it looks. Right. The field was square. Okay. Not a diamond shape. Field was square. The bases were 60 feet apart, right? And there weren't bases on the ground, but rather posts. The posts were about 4 foot tall, about 1.5 meters tall.
What could go wrong?
Right? Okay. Well, just watch where you're going. Don't look at the ball, as your Little League coaches always tell you, right? Don't look at the ball. Okay. The baseball itself was about half as heavy as it is nowadays. And wildly, the batter was positioned halfway between first base and what was called fourth base. Okay. Right. Now, so this is how they're playing town ball, really rounders, in the 1830s. Okay. So, meanwhile, in New York, there's a club called the New York Knickerbocker Sporting Club, right, which makes their own version of the game. All right. Here's what their field looked like. All right. So they got rid of the posts. Replaced it with a bag. They made the batter stand at home plate, it was now called, instead of fourth base. And they played a game that looks a lot like baseball. Now, back in those days, the batter got his choice, right? So he could tell the pitcher how to throw the ball, whether he wanted a low ball or a high ball, for example. There was no limit on pitches you could take, right? So you could just stand up there for half an hour until you got a pitch that you liked. Right? Balls and strikes didn't really exist in those days. And as we typically say, the first official game of baseball was played here on June 19th, 1846 in New York. Now, remember, the game is invented by the New York Knickerbockers, right? They take on a team which was sort of just put together, a team called simply the New York Nine, which is a sweet name. How about the Las Vegas Five? How about that for the basketball team, right? The New York Nine. The Knickerbockers play the New York Nine in the first official game, and the New York Nine wins 23-1. How do you like that? How do you like that? You invented the game.
Yeah.
and then you lose by 22 runs in baseball. Okay. Now, Chadwick goes on in his piece to talk about how the New York game, as they call it, this version of Town Ball, became the national game. And in the 1850s and 1860s, there was actually the first league in America called the National Association. Now, the thing was, it wasn't so much a league as an association. What this was hundreds of clubs in America, which basically agreed to play the New York game, right? And yes, they tracked the individual games as official games versus other National Association team. But just wild to think that there was this effort put forth to adopt one version of the game. Still, we don't have codified rules. However, we have some guidelines like this. Okay, so Chadwick in his piece in the Sporting News goes on. He's talking about early games. He says in 1867, the second Grand Baseball Tour was made by the National Club of Washington. Games were played in Columbus, Cincinnati, Louisville, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and Chicago. So again, the game is becoming a real Midwestern game at this point. And he says, up to the arrival of the Nationals in Chicago, victory perched on their banner every game. Gotta love this early 20th century writing. In Chicago, however, the Nationals sustained their only defeat, and that was at the hands of the Forest City Club of Rockford, of which club young A.G. Spalding was the pitcher. Okay, now, here we go. Spalding, key character. A.G. Spalding was also known as Albert Spalding, and he was one of the key figures in early baseball. All right. He was the player manager of the Chicago White Stockings, one of the more successful clubs in the National League, or one of the most successful clubs in America, I should say. As such, Spalding was one of the founders of the National League in 1876, right? Probably not coincidentally, this was the same year that Spalding opened up his massive sporting goods store in Chicago.
Oh.
And to this day, Spalding is still the only supplier of baseballs to the major league. Okay, so no coincidence there. Spalding is plugged right in to the beginning of baseball. Okay, now, so back to 1904 for a moment. Chadwick's story is about 1,000 words long. Okay, this story is repeated in other newspapers across the country. All right, and at least one man was not amused by this story. Who? President of the Chicago Cubs, Albert Spalding. So, what he does in 1904, in early 1905, after reading this piece, was to form the so-called Mills Commission. The Mills Commission was a group that set out to research the origins of baseball. And to be honest, the agenda was to give baseball an American origin story. All right. So on April 1st of that year, Spalding wrote a much longer piece in response to Chadwick's piece of the previous few months ago. And in this piece, he called for Chadwick to prove it. Right. He wants Chadwick to give him some proof of his assertions about rounders, about town ball, and whatever. Of course, how, right? He doesn't have tape recordings. He doesn't have video. He doesn't have photo. Like, what's he gonna do? Say, oh, I remember, right? Which is what he did in the piece, right? And The piece by Spalding is quite interesting because he talks about how Chadwick should prove it. And then from out of nowhere, he starts talking about how him and some of the other major league ball players had gone on a tour internationally. You know, we talked about this when we did the Jim Thorpe piece in this segment. And he describes this, how they were playing rounders against this British team. And they played this game, and they're like, "There's no way this is baseball." So that's basically Spalding's argument, right? Now, Spalding goes ahead and writes this piece here. Okay, I don't have the piece here, unfortunately, but he writes this piece, and then 4 days later, and this is where it gets weird. 4 days later, a mining engineer named Albert Graves from Colorado Springs, Colorado. For some reason, he's in Dayton, Ohio, reads the newspaper with Spalding's letter in it, Akron, Ohio, I'm sorry, writes a letter to the Akron Beacon Journal newspaper claiming that Civil War General Abner Doubleday had invented baseball. Okay, so 3 years later, the commission returns its report, and Spalding makes the announcement in early April, before the season began in 1908, where he said, both based mainly on this single letter, says, "I claim that the game of baseball is entirely of American origin and has no relation to or connection with any game of any other country, except insofar as all games of ball have a certain similarity and family relationship." Okay? Pure like USA kind of stuff here. The finding is based entirely on this letter. And here we go. Now, here is Spalding justifying the commission's decision. Right? He says, "It certainly appeals to all Americans' pride to have had the great national game of baseball created and named by a major general in the U.S. Army, and to have that same game played by the soldiers of the Civil War, who, at the conclusion of the war, disseminated baseball throughout the length and breadth of the United States, and thus gave to the game its national character." God bless America, right? Now, this is the sort of thing that's happening in the first decade of the 20th century in America. The president is Teddy Roosevelt, the original Rough Rider, right? From which Saskatchewan gets its football team name. So, and Teddy was very patriotic. Teddy was very expansionist. He wanted to take the Philippines and make it part of America. He wanted to take Hawaii and make it part of America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very patriotic time period in American history. This one is pretty amazing. This was an editorial in the Washington Post after this announcement was made. Okay. Washington Post says, "This is incredible. How anyone could contend that a game which is so fast and which requires so much agility and quick thought could be of English origin is hard to understand." Whoa! Didn't they make rugby in England? That's kind of a fast-paced game. I don't know. I mean, this here is just pure prejudice, right, on the part of the American. While fans of the country have not stood aghast waiting for a decision to this matter, it is nevertheless pleasing to know that baseball is an American game in every sense of the word, and that rounders, cat, or any of the old games was in no way responsible for the greatest of outdoor amusements. Can you imagine? This guy was
trolling.
Post.
This guy was trolling before trolling was even a thing.
Right. Trolling the British, who very few are going to read this newspaper. So Pretty easy target. Okay. Happily, most of the Doubleday story was easily punched holes through, right? Pretty easy stuff. I mean, for example, just from the start, our letter writer Albert Graves claims that it was 1839 when Abner Doubleday invented the game in Cooperstown, New York, of course. But at that time, Doubleday was 20 years old. He was at West Point Military Academy. All right. That's 150 miles away from Cooperstown in the days before cars. Okay. Not likely. All right. In fact, 90 years passed before we could find any connection between Doubleday and baseball at all. And that was this a Civil War historian in 1998 found basically an invoice for baseballs and bats for his northern troops. That's the connection. Now, Doubleday, like so many of the educated intellectuals of the 19th century, was a diarist, right? This guy wrote 60 volumes of personal diaries. Plus, we have hundreds of his letters and correspondence. Not one of them mentions baseball, right? So seems pretty unlikely that this happened. Interestingly enough, in 1937, when they were just about to open the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, where the first game was supposedly played, a committee from the New York State Legislature went to Cooperstown and said, "Oh, yes, there's no doubt baseball was invented here." Right? This is the birthplace of baseball. Right? Seriously, guys? Seriously? Okay. So basically, nowadays, thankfully, about the only people who believe that that Doubleday invented baseball are the Hall of Fame and apparently the New York State Legislature. It's pretty wild, but apparently the rumor is, and this is a crazy one, I'm going to have to do more research into this one. Supposedly in 1953, the United States Congress formally recognized Henry Cartwright, who was one of the guys on the famous Cincinnati Red Stockings teams of the 1860s, that he was the inventor of baseball, officially by the Senate. However, there is no proof of this, right? So this might just be part of the myth as well, is that the Congress officially recognizes, Cartwright as the inventor of baseball. So all we're left with is the question of who invented baseball. Well, the proper answer is probably no one, right? And I'm not sure why we are so obsessed with this one man, one game idea. Look, if you want to be American, if you want to be patriotic, if you want to be jingoistic, maybe it might be a better way to look at this to say, yeah, it was the product of several people's innovation. Wouldn't that be a more positive and more realistic scenario? I mean, couldn't we give credit to lots of Americans that way instead of just one decent Civil War general? So just a theoretical question there. However, I'm happy to see that the Doubleday myth has long been exploded. I was taught this as a child by some people who still believed. But luckily, no one takes it seriously anymore. And in fact, there is a page on Wikipedia called the Doubleday Myth. I encourage everybody to check out the Chadwick story. It's only about 1,000 to 1,100 words. Really interesting stuff. Actually, pretty plainly written for this early 20th century style. It's actually pretty straightforward. And it's just a good way to appreciate Chadwick and the early history of baseball. One other thing I should mention is that Chadwick is also the creator of the box score.
Oh,
So, yeah, incredibly important. Up until this point, no such concept existed. And now basically every sport except for soccer has a box score the next day. So we can also give credit to Chadwick. So, like I say, check out the show notes and check out the piece by Chadwick on the early history of baseball. Interesting stuff.
very, very interesting stuff. I'm always
Yeah.
fascinated hearing these stories. These
Yeah,
origins.
well, I got a million of them. History, they say that truth is stranger than fiction, and it's crazy, kids. But the older you get, the more interested you get in history, and the stories are incredible. Like some of the stuff you find out is just unbelievable, and this is one of the main issues I have with based on a true story, is that so often the actual story is a lot more interesting. A great example of this is Hoosiers. Hoosiers, fantastic movie, great score, great soundtrack, inspiring story, but really, really, really cheesy, right? Really just, sports movie. The real story of this team from Hickory, it wasn't even Hickory, but the real story of this team is absolutely incredible. Maybe someday I'll do that as we head down the basketball home stretch, because that one is really fantastic, but a lot more complicated, not so easily portrayed in the movies. Same thing here. We have a nice, palatable story about a Civil War general just creating this game, or you can have this messy, organic, kind of much more realistic historical perspective. Your choice. I prefer the Chadwick story myself. So that has been your sports history mini lecture for the day.